The word Diedovshchina denotes an informal order in the Russian army based on violence by older soldiers against conscripts and systemic humiliation. The roots of this practice reach back to the Soviet era when mass conscription and a lack of systemic oversight allowed brutal customs to become entrenched. Older soldiers called Dziady seize power over newcomers by enforcing obedience and a series of humiliating duties. The hierarchy in this system is based on length of service rather than competence, which encourages the privileging of brutality over professionalism. Methods used against conscripts include regular beatings, humiliating chores, and psychological abuse intended to break resistance and subordinate the young. Young soldiers are forced to work beyond standards, washing, cleaning, carrying belongings, and performing private services for superiors. They are often deprived of their food rations, and access to basic goods like tea or cigarettes is arbitrarily controlled by the older ones. Brutal initiation rituals involve systematic beatings and prolonged psychological humiliations intended to break recruits' will. Living conditions in the barracks are unequal. The younger sleep in worse places, and personal space is treated as a privilege for the Dziady. Officers in most cases turn a blind eye to abuses, which reinforces a sense of impunity and nullifies formal control mechanisms. In some units, officers even exploit Diedovshchina as a cheap way to maintain order without involving disciplinary structures. Complaints filed by conscripts encounter administrative indifference and sometimes end in reprisals against the complainants. Nighttime violence intensifies because darkness and isolation create favorable conditions for the most severe acts of brutality against young soldiers. The psychological consequences of this system include chronic anxiety, emotional inhibition, and frequent sleep and concentration disorders among victims. Fear of waves of violence drives desperate attempts to avoid service, sometimes through escapes, self-harm, or tragic attempts to end one's life. Many who leave the army return to society with lasting psychological traumas, often diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. The scale of the phenomenon is significant. Non-governmental organizations regularly document cases, and the media reveal successive scandals involving beatings. Statistics point to tens of tragic suicide cases every year, which shows the destructive impact of the military environment on young people. Violence affects virtually every formation, and the problem is most visible in units recruiting from the poorer regions of the country. Many conscripts come from areas with limited prospects where military service is the only path to work and material stability. The physical consequences of this violence include fractures, injuries, internal complications, and long-term bodily damage left without adequate medical care. Military hospitals often conceal the causes of injuries by recording them as less controversial accidents or omitting treatment documentation. Some young people return from the army permanently maimed, and their cases are sometimes erased from official reports or placed under classified annotations. Alcohol plays a significant role in escalating aggression because frequent drinking in units lowers inhibitions and fosters brutal behavior toward conscripts. Conscripts are forced to buy alcohol for their elders, which places an additional burden on them and creates further mechanisms of humiliation and control. When officers abuse alcohol, their responses to violence are often delayed, inadequate, or entirely absent, which worsens the victim's situation. Tragic events in the army are often linked to binge drinking, and alcohol acts as a catalyst for escalating conflicts between soldiers. Authorities formally declare a fight against Diedovshchina. However, these actions often prove superficial and ineffective against the institutional culture. Reforms introduced, such as shortening service time or installing camera monitoring, have been implemented in some units but have not eliminated the problem systemically. Human rights organizations and independent media play a key role in publicizing cases and putting pressure on military authorities. The internet and leaked video materials have contributed to raising public awareness and exposing practices that previously remained hidden. The causes of the continuity of this phenomenon are multidimensional and include staffing deficiencies, a weak culture of respect, and a lack of commander accountability. Diedovshchina has become an element of routine that soldiers learn from the earliest days of service, which makes its dismantling by official programs difficult. The lack of transparent investigations and witness protection discourages victims from reporting abuses and fosters a culture of silence in military units. The social costs include destroyed family life, increased unemployment among veterans, and a burden on the healthcare system for rehabilitating the injured. The economic effects also concern the loss of public trust in institutions that, instead of protecting citizens, allow them to be harmed. Some preventive projects focus on educating commanders, changing promotion systems, and creating channels for anonymous reporting of abuses. However, the lack of disciplinary consequences and constant personnel rotations often nullify the effects of short-term reform initiatives. Cultural change requires time, but without strong political and military will, every reform remains merely a paper scheme. The persistence of the problem shows that the military tradition of violence finds allies in structures that value obedience more than the dignity of the individual. Observers stress that effective combating must include human rights training, psychiatric support, and real accountability mechanisms. Survivors' accounts constitute important testimony and a tool of pressure that make it possible to understand the scale and human dimension of this tragedy. Without decisive and consistent action, every next generation of conscripts is at risk of perpetuating the same brutal tradition. Families of the harmed often remain without legal and social support, which deepens the isolation of former conscripts and hinders their pursuit of justice. Legal changes are necessary, including witness protection, transparency of proceedings, and real sanctions against perpetrators and commanders who tolerate violence. International organizations and experts have repeatedly condemned violent practices in the Army and called for transparent investigations and witness protection. Real transformation requires not only declarations, but also independent investigations, psychological support, and mechanisms that will ensure enforcement of accountability.